Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because, well, we're going to unpack one of the most fascinating and honestly urgent economic mysteries of our time. We're looking closely at India's macro paradox. It's this incredibly delicate balance between jobless growth on one side and a rapidly ticking demographic clock on the other.
So, right off the bat, here's the big question. How does a booming economy simply run out of jobs? It's a glaring anomaly. Economists all over the world are paying very close attention to this. On the one hand, India is seeing robust, world-leading GDP growth. We're talking an average of somewhere between 6.6 and 7.3%. That's huge. But then, on the other hand, employment growth has remained stubbornly below 2%. Okay, let's dive into this. The formal textbook term for this phenomenon is jobless growth. Historically, developing economies move from agriculture straight into labor-intensive manufacturing, right? And that phase absorbs massive amounts of unskilled and semi-skilled workers. But India largely bypassed that traditional manufacturing phase. They jumped straight into high-value, capital-intensive services. So what we're seeing is economic expansion currently being driven by capital and productivity rather than by mass labor-absorptive job creation.
And here is where the stakes get incredibly high. 1 million. That is the exact number of youth entering India's workforce every single month. Literally every month. It is a staggering demographic reality, and it puts immense, unrelenting pressure on the economy to generate productive employment.
Moving on to Section 2, the data disconnect, PLFS versus CMIE methodologies. To truly understand the scope of this problem, we have to look at how we measure it, because the unemployment numbers you hear often depend entirely on who is actually doing the counting. For instance, the government's PLFS uses a usual status, tracking a full 365 days plus a 7-day current weekly status. Meanwhile, the private CMIE tracker uses a fixed panel, and they're looking strictly at employment on the day of the survey or the day before. This is exactly why we see wildly different numbers, like the PLFS reporting a 5.2% unemployment rate versus CMIE reporting 7.2% in early 2026. It's a methodological mystery. They're just using completely different reference periods and sampling frames. And this brilliantly illustrates how those totally different methodologies impact specific groups, especially women. CMIE's snapshot approach often underrepresents transient workers and misses informal female labor entirely. That's why it estimates urban female participation at under 10%. On the flip side, PLFS uses detailed probes to explicitly capture subsidiary, unpaid, or informal work. So it's absolutely crucial to keep in mind that these datasets aren't necessarily right or wrong. They're simply capturing two completely different realities of the exact same labor market.
Section 3. Youth and the Skills Gap. The educated unemployment crisis.
Let's shift our focus away from the macro data for a second and look at the human element. We're zooming in specifically on the youth workforce trying to enter the market today. For the 15 to 29 age cohort, a full 25% are classified as NEET. That stands for not in employment, education, or training. Think about that. A quarter of the entire youth population is completely disengaged from the productive economy.
Which brings us to a really troubling paradox. We are currently seeing a massive crisis of what's called educated unemployment. The India Skill Report, along with the ILO, found that nearly 50% of Indian graduates are actually unemployable due to severe digital and vocational skill deficits. To put that into perspective, 75% of youth are unable to send an email with an attachment. Joblessness is actually rising alongside educational attainment, mostly because the skills being taught in schools simply do not match what the industry is demanding.
And as you might guess, this skills gap doesn't impact everyone equally. By the first quarter of 2026, the youth unemployment rate hit 14% for males, but a staggering 17.7% for females. Young women are facing an unemployment rate that is continuously climbing month over month, effectively locking them out of the formal economy. Section 4. The missing female workforce, systematic exclusion and unpaid labor. Now, what's really interesting about this is that it highlights what experts consider the deepest structural failure of the Indian labor market, the gender disparities. When we look at rural women, they show a 39.2% participation rate. But here's the catch. The vast majority of this is unpaid, self-employed farm labor. It's about survival, not formal employment. Meanwhile, for urban women, participation plummets to just 25.4%. And those who do actively seek work face an extreme 9.1% open unemployment rate. The structural barriers here are just immense. To really underscore the absolute severity of the systemic exclusion, women account for nearly 95% of that youth NEET population we discussed earlier. 95%! When nearly half of your potential demographic dividend is structurally excluded from education and formal employment, the broader economy suffers a massive, massive loss of potential.
Section 5, Evaluating Policy Interventions. What is actually being done to fix the paradox?
Let's transition over to the government's response and take an objective look at 3 major policy tools currently in play. First up is the Employment-Linked Incentive, or ELI scheme. This is a direct, massive intervention targeting the creation of 3.5 crore formal jobs. It subsidizes formal employment by offering direct cash subsidies up to 15,000 rupees for first-time formal employees, and it provides manufacturing incentives for employers who are expanding their headcounts. Interestingly enough, it even requires employees to take online financial literacy courses to unlock some of those funds.
Next, we have the Production-Linked Incentive, or PLI scheme. Now, while PLI has been highly successful in driving massive export volumes, think mobile manufacturing, for example, it has very low labor elasticity. Because the incentive structure is tied to sales and capital productivity, it inadvertently favors capital-intensive automation over actual human assembly. Plus, there are high minimum investment thresholds, which basically act as barriers to smaller domestic MSMEs. So it's a fantastic program for the GDP and exports, but it really struggles to create mass jobs. So the crucial point here becomes incredibly clear when we examine the MGNREGA Rural Safety Net in Bihar. Notice how the average days of employment and the number of households actually completing 100 days dropped sharply from 2022 to 2024, and that happened even though the daily wage rate went up. It's a rationing paradox. Poor states with the highest demand for work actually end up providing fewer days of employment due to administrative and fiscal constraints. Section 6, Securing the Demographic Dividend, the Ticking Clock to 2050. All right, let's pivot to the macro future, bringing our explainer to a highly urgent forward-looking conclusion, 324 million. That is the upper bound number of productive jobs India must create by the year 2050. By then, its working-age population is going to swell to an incredible 1.337 billion people. We are literally looking at a ticking clock, and the sheer scale of job creation required is unprecedented. To successfully shift workers from low-productivity agriculture into high-productivity manufacturing and services, experts have mapped out some very specific structural steps. First, lower tariffs to deeply integrate into global electronics value chains. Second, fully implement the labor codes to remove formal hiring friction. Third, aggressively align university curricula directly with industry skill demands to finally solve that graduate unemployability crisis. And fourth, build robust social safety nets to protect the rapidly growing gig economy. Which leaves us with the ultimate question. Will India's demographic transition be a historic dividend that drives unparalleled economic growth, or will it become a demographic disaster filled with unemployed, frustrated youth? It's a challenge of massive, unprecedented scale, and watching how it all unfolds is going to be absolutely critical, not just for India, but for the entire global economy. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep learning, keep analyzing the data, and we will see you next time.